Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to go over, at least we're going to start to go over part of the endocrine system. And this is an organ system that, believe it or not, is kind of near and dear to my heart, because when I was in graduate school, I was fortunate enough to take a whole semester course on endocrinology. I learned a lot in that class. So it's one of my favorite organ systems, which is probably not something that very many anatomy and physiology professors would say, because it is very complex. And there's a lot of, well, you can get into a lot of organic chemistry if you really want to dig into the synthetic pathways that the endocrine glands produce their hormones. Usually they're produced from some kind of precursor, and then they modify some of the functional groups to produce the hormone. So, I'm going to start out by just kind of going over an overview of the endocrine system and some of the endocrine glands that are part of it. The endocrine system is actually one of many different communication systems of the body. Okay, two most important ones are probably the nervous system and the endocrine system. But there are some other less well-known mechanisms that also can allow for communication. So one of these lesser-known ways is through gap junctions. Gap junctions are specialized protein complexes that are located between adjacent cells. And gap junctions actually form a pore that connects the cytoplasm of the two cells. That can allow for more rapid communication from one cell to another. A good example of this is in cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle fibers have specialized electrical junctions that contain, they're called intercalated discs. And they contain gap junctions that basically connect the cytoplasm of the two cells. And so when an action potential occurs in one cardiac cell, it spreads over its surface, and the sodium ions that move into the cell during the action potential can diffuse through the gap junction and depolarize the next cell. So it basically electrically couples the two cells, and that allows for communication signals to travel from one cell to the next, to the next, to the next. And that basically is how electrical signals spread through the heart as a whole, so that the heart can contract as one unit. Another way that the nervous system, another form of communication the nervous system uses is neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters allow neurons to stimulate another neuron or an effector. Okay, so the nervous system uses both electrical as well as chemicals for communication. It uses an electrical form of communication in the form of action potentials along the length of an axon. And when that signal gets to the end of the axon, that causes the release of a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger, just like hormones that are used in the endocrine system. Another form of rather local communication is our paracrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are just simply paracrines, are chemical signals that stimulate nearby cells, usually just adjacent cells. So paracrine hormones, as opposed to the hormones released by the endocrine system, paracrines don't travel very far. They only affect adjacent cells. Hormones, on the other hand, are chemical messengers released by endocrine glands that are released into the bloodstream from the endocrine gland, and then the hormone circulates in the blood, where it can stimulate another tissue or organ a considerable distance away from where the hormones are produced. So hormones are chemical messengers that travel in the bloodstream to tissues and organs that can be a considerable distance away. And they're produced in only very, very minute quantities. They're very, very powerful substances. So, for the rest of this week, we're going to be studying the hormones produced by the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is made up of glands, tissues, and cells that secrete hormones. The study of these glands and hormones is called endocrinology. Endocrinologists often study disorders of they study and treat disorders of the endocrine system that can affect a large number of different organs, including the reproductive system, and just about any organ in the body. So endocrine glands are the organs that are traditional sources of hormones, although now hormone replacement can be achieved through genetic engineering. Genetic engineers have succeeded in inserting the genes that code for some of the peptide hormones into bacterial cells. And then culture those bacteria cells in large vats, and the bacteria cells will start secreting those hormones. They can then isolate them, and they can use them to treat people whose body is not producing enough of that hormone. So, hormones can be defined as chemical messengers transported by the bloodstream that stimulate physiological responses often a considerable distance away from their source. So this diagram shows some of the major endocrine glands. There's actually some organs in the body that you wouldn't normally think of as an endocrine gland, yet they do produce hormones. Just a couple examples would be the heart. Heart, believe it or not, actually produces 2 different hormones that are involved in regulation of sodium levels in the body. Another example are the kidneys. The kidneys produces the hormone erythropoietin, or EPO for short. That stimulates red blood cell production. It boosts red cell production. But these are some of the traditional organs that are considered to be part of the endocrine system. There's actually 2 important endocrine glands that are actually kind of part of the brain. So they're referred to as neuroendocrine glands because they're part of both the nervous system as well as the endocrine system. So the first one of which is probably the most important one is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus contains over a dozen nuclei, which are clusters of neurons that control a number of autonomic processes in the body. And the hypothalamus also produces hormones called releasing factors. These releasing factors control the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, which is just inferior to the hypothalamus. In fact, the pituitary gland hangs from the hypothalamus by a narrow stalk of tissue, like right here. It's called the infundibulum. And some of the releasing factors travel down through blood vessels in the infundibulum down to the anterior pituitary. Pituitary gland is really 2 glands in one. There's 2 parts to it. And they develop from different embryonic tissues. The anterior part is called the anterior pituitary. That secretes about 6 different hormones. And then the posterior part is called the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary develops from a different embryonic tissue, and it actually releases 2 hormones that are synthesized in the hypothalamus. So the pituitary hormones are not really produced by the pituitary gland. They're produced in the hypothalamus, and they're actually transported by, they're transported through axons down to the posterior pituitary where they're released. So we'll take a closer look at that, the way in which those hormones the release of those hormones are controlled a little bit later on in this chapter. Then, in the cervical region, which is the neck, there are two important endocrine glands. The first one is the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is kind of a U-shaped gland. It's located just below the larynx. And thyroid gland secretes an iodine-containing hormone called thyroxine, as well as lesser amounts of a slightly modified form of thyroxine. It's called T3. But most of the hormones secreted by the thyroid gland is thyroxine, which is also known as T4. Then, if you look, this is a posterior view of the thyroid gland, so you can see the right and left side of it. You see it better though from the anterior side. And down here is the posterior side of the trachea. So embedded in the posterior side of the thyroid gland are four clusters of cells that make up the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands secrete a parathyroid hormone that regulates blood calcium levels. And in fact, it regulates calcium levels in all the body fluids. Calcium is a very important ion because it's necessary for muscle contraction, because you need that in order to release neurotransmitters. And it also plays a role in the functioning of the heart. They actually first discovered, physiologists first discovered the parathyroid hormones in patients that had thyroid cancer. And when surgeons first started removing the thyroid gland in order to treat thyroid cancer, some of the patients just very suddenly died, and they didn't know why. Well, come to find out, the reason they died is because when they removed the thyroid gland, they also removed the parathyroid glands, which are embedded in the posterior part of the thyroid gland. When they removed the parathyroid glands, their body couldn't regulate their levels of calcium in their body fluids, and that caused the death of those patients. And that's how those glands were discovered. Then down in the abdomen, there are two important endocrine glands. The first is the pancreas. Pancreas is kind of an unusual endocrine gland because it's both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. The exocrine portion releases enzymes through a duct into the small intestines. Those enzymes help you to digest your food. So the exocrine portion of the pancreas is part of the digestive system. It allows you to digest your food. The endocrine portion of the pancreas is made up of individual cells that secrete two different hormones. One of them is insulin, the other one is glucagon. Insulin is a hormone that allows the cells of your body to absorb glucose. Without insulin, your cells can't absorb glucose very well. And so the glucose levels build up in your bloodstream because they can't be absorbed by the cells of your body. When the glucose levels of your blood remain chronically high over long periods of time, it can have all kinds of damaging effects on your body. It makes blood vessels less permeable. And so it can result in blindness, it can result, can make people more susceptible to infection of their feet. So sometimes people with diabetes mellitus get gangrene in their feet, and they have to have their feet amputated or even their whole leg amputated. Makes them more susceptible to heart attacks and strokes. There's all kinds of health problems that are associated with diabetes. So insufficient insulin is, well, there's two different forms of diabetes, one of which is just caused by insufficient insulin secretion by the pancreas. That can be treated with insulin injections. The other one is type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin insensitivity. Your body produces enough insulin, but your cells just become insensitive to the insulin. Possibly because there's just not enough insulin receptors for the insulin to bind to. In order for a hormone to work, you have to have both the hormone as well as the hormone receptor. If you don't have enough receptor, then the hormone's not going to do any good. In fact, in some people with type 2 diabetes, their levels of insulin are actually higher than normal, yet their blood glucose levels remain high. Okay, then the other endocrine gland that's in the abdomen are the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands also are kind of strange because it has two parts. The outer layer of tissue of the adrenal glands is an endocrine gland. That part's called the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex secretes over a dozen different hormones, some of which help to regulate blood glucose levels. There's others that are released when a person is under a lot of stress, and like cortisol is released when you're under stress. That tends to suppress your immune system. There's hormones released by the adrenal glands that mimic the effects of some of the reproductive hormones like testosterone. In addition, we learned earlier that the deeper parts of the adrenal glands, called the adrenal medulla, are actually made up of not of endocrine cells, but of a different cell type. What kind of cell makes up the adrenal medulla that plays a role in the fight or flight response of the sympathetic division? What kind of cells are those? Anyone remember? I'll give you a hint. Those cells secrete epinephrine, which is similar to norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter. So what kind of cells secrete neurotransmitter? I know you all know the answer to that last question I asked. So what kind of cells in the body produce neurotransmitters? It's the cells of the nervous system, right? So what are the names of those cells that release neurotransmitters, that produce action potentials? You're probably thinking too hard. It's not a hard question. Neurons. See, I knew you knew it. Okay, those cells in the adrenal medulla are actually modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. But instead of releasing norepinephrine, they release epinephrine, which has the same effect on cells as norepinephrine, which is the neurotransmitter released by the sympathetic division. Okay? So when the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine that causes a mass activation of all of the cells that have adrenergic receptors. And so it causes a mass activation of the fight or flight response in the body. Okay? And that supplements the norepinephrine released by the sympathetic nerves. So the adrenal glands, which sit up on top of the kidneys, it's both an endocrine gland as well as a modified neurons that secrete epinephrine. It's part of the nervous system. Okay. Then the other traditional endocrine gland are the gonads. The gonads in both males and females. The gonads in the males are called testes, and the gonads in the female are ovaries. The testes secrete primarily testosterone, which is necessary for spermatogenesis, which is the process of sperm cell production. The ovaries produce two different hormones. They produce estrogen and progesterone, which are involved in regulation of the reproductive cycle in females. Okay. So the gonads are not only the primary sex organs that produce gametes, the eggs and sperm cells, but they're also endocrine glands. And those hormones produced by the gonads have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which in turn influence the release of estrogen and progesterone. So those are what are considered to be the traditional endocrine glands. Like I said, there's other organs like the heart and the kidneys also secrete hormones. Even parts of the digestive system secrete hormones as well, including the liver. So you want to be carefully, you don't confuse the exocrine glands with the endocrine glands. Okay? Exocrine glands are glands primarily associated with the digestive system that release a secretion through a duct into the hollow cavity of an organ. And so on the inside of our digestive tract, technically that is outside of our body, because you have an opening at one end of our digestive tract in the mouth, and there's a continuous tube that goes all the way down to your anus. So typically that's outside the cells of our body. So the lumen of our digestive tract is external. So that's why they call them exocrine. Exo means outside. So the secretion of the exocrine glands carry out extracellular digestion that's outside of our cells, outside of our body. And the primary function of those hormones, or those secretions, I should say, is to help digest our food. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, are ductless. They're ductless glands. They don't release their secretions through a duct. Instead, their secretions diffuse into very dense capillary networks that are inside of the endocrine gland. And those hormones then diffuse into the capillaries, and then they travel through our bloodstream throughout our body. But they'll diffuse out of capillaries in other parts of our body and bind to receptors on other cells that can be quite a distance away from the endocrine gland itself. So secretion of the endocrine glands is more internal, and the effects are in some cases are even inside the cells of the target tissues and target organs. So it produces intracellular effects like altering the metabolism of cells. And there's actually two ways that they do that, and we'll see those two main mechanisms of hormone action. I don't know if we'll get to that today, but we'll probably see it on Friday. So this is just a comparison of the nervous and endocrine system. Both the endocrine system and the nervous system are communication systems, but they go about it with different mechanisms, and because of that, the speed at which those two organ systems work is different. The mechanism of communication is different. The nervous system uses both electrical and chemical means of communication. The endocrine system only uses chemicals for sending messages. Speed is very different. The nervous system reacts very rapidly, anywhere from 1 to 10 milliseconds, which is 1/1000th of a second, because action potentials can travel very fast. Endocrine system reacts very slowly because the endocrine system only uses chemicals. It doesn't use electrical signals, which can travel faster. The chemicals have to first diffuse out of the cells of the endocrine gland into the capillaries. They're inside that gland. Then they have to circulate through the bloodstream, and blood moves a lot more slowly than action potentials. And then in some cases it has to, well, in all cases, it has to diffuse out of systemic capillaries in the body and diffuse into the target organ in order to produce their effect. So it takes a lot longer for hormones to produce their actions. Some hormones can produce an effect within just a few seconds. Others might take several days for them to take effect. Because in addition to being transported more slowly, some hormones have to diffuse to the inside of the cell, bind to a receptor, and that triggers protein synthesis, which causes the production of enzymes. Those enzymes then cause a change in the metabolism of that cell. And that whole process of protein synthesis, which is actually a result of gene expression, that takes a certain amount of time. So in some cases it may take days before that produces its effect. The area of the effect also differs. The nervous system, the pathways generally travel directly to just a small area of the body, or in some cases even a single cell. And so the effects of the nervous system are very targeted, and they're very, very specific. Might be specific just to one population of cells. Effects of the endocrine system, though, are much more general because they circulate through the bloodstream. So theoretically, they could affect any part of the body. And some hormones do. For example, thyroxine. Thyroxine affects almost all the cells of the body. If thyroxine release increases, that increases your metabolic rate. It boosts metabolism. So the effects of the endocrine system can be very widespread. Okay. Another hormone that has very widespread effects is insulin. Insulin can affect just about any cell in the body. There's a few that it doesn't affect, but for the most part, it's almost the whole body. So, in summary, the endocrine system consists of glands, cells, and tissues that secrete hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers transported by the blood that stimulate physiological responses, often a considerable distance away. That distance is what distinguishes them from paracrines, which just affect adjacent cells. The response of the endocrine system is much slower than the nervous system, but it persists longer. The effect of hormones will persist until those hormones are either broken down or excreted. So until they're excreted, they're just going to continue producing their effect. And the endocrine system sometimes has effects that overlap that of the nervous system, for example. Some neurons secrete hormones into the bloodstream, and both the nervous system and the endocrine system can have overlapping effects on target cells. One example, the sympathetic nerves release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, yet the adrenal glands can secrete epinephrine that has the same effect as norepinephrine. So there's sort of some overlapping effects. Okay, let's do a review question, and then we're going to move on to the next section of chapter 17. So I gave you an overview of some of the different endocrine glands in the body. So which of these is not an endocrine gland? Okay, which of those is not an endocrine gland? The code for these questions is hormone. Make sure you answer the questions so you'll show up on my attendance list so you won't get marked absent. Okay, let's take a look at the responses. You can go ahead and still answer it, Dave. All right, well, we got a mixture of responses, okay? Well, the adrenal cortex secretes over a dozen hormones, so that's an endocrine gland. Pancreas secretes insulin, glucagon, those are both hormones. Thyroid gland secretes thyroxine primarily, as well as T3. Posterior pituitary, that's sort of a neuroendocrine gland. I would say it's still classified as an endocrine gland, even though the hormones it releases are synthesized in the hypothalamus, it still releases a hormone. The adrenal medulla, however, remember, is made up of modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. So technically its cells are cells of the nervous system, and it secretes a chemical that acts like a neurotransmitter. So probably the best answer, I think, would be adrenal medulla, because all the others do. Second best choice would probably be the posterior pituitary, because it doesn't really synthesize its own hormones. Those are synthesized in the hypothalamus. They're transported through axons down to the posterior pituitary. Those same axons that release those hormones at the posterior pituitary. But see, depends on how you want to look at it. But I might have to accept the posterior pituitary as an answer as well. So, Okay, let's do another one. Endocrine gland, this is an easier one. Endocrine glands always secrete their hormones into what? By the way, some endocrine glands don't secrete their hormones at a constant level or at a constant rate. Some of them actually secrete their hormones kind of in spikes. Like some of the hormones are released in a lot higher quantities first thing in the morning than later on in the day. So the amount of hormone they release is not always constant. It varies over the case of the day in some cases. Okay, let's take a look at everyone's responses here. Most of you said bloodstream, and that's correct. That's part of the definition of a hormone. It's a chemical that's secreted directly into the bloodstream, as opposed to through a duct. All right, so next section is about hormones and their actions. And there's two major mechanisms of hormone action that are carried out by different kinds of hormones. So in this next section, we're going to look at the different chemical classes of hormones. There are some hormones, just like there's different classes of neurotransmitter according to the type of chemical. There's different chemical classes of hormones. And actually, a lot of them is very similar because there's a lot of overlap between the endocrine system and the nervous system. We're also going to look at two different mechanisms of transport. In order for a hormone to have its effect, it has to be transported through the blood. There's two ways in which that occurs. And then we're going to look at the two major mechanisms of action of hormones. And then we're going to look at how target cells can actually regulate the number of receptors for hormones. And then we're going to look at how hormones are eliminated so that they don't continue to produce their action after it's no longer needed. So in order to stimulate target cells, hormones first have to be synthesized and then released from the endocrine gland. They have to be transported by the blood. They have to bind to a receptor. They have to have a mechanism of action which produces the effect that they are supposed to. And then they have to be removed from bloodstream so that after they're done carrying out their action. So if any one of these things does not function properly, then the hormone is not going to be able to produce its effect. So there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. All right, so the different classes of hormones include, the first one are steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are lipids, most of which are derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a large nonpolar compound that consists of six carbon rings, three 6-carbon rings, and a 5-carbon ring attached to it. And by attaching different functional groups to cholesterol, our body can produce different hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Now, since cholesterol and the steroid hormones are nonpolar, they can diffuse across the plasma membrane of cells very easily. They just diffuse right through the cell membrane because the middle of the cell membrane is nonpolar, and nonpolar substances can mix well with other Other hormones like peptide hormones, which are small proteins, they cannot go through the cell membrane. So they have to use a different kind of mechanism than the steroid hormones. So another class of hormones, another group, are the monoamines, sometimes called the biogenic amines. Monoamines are synthesized they're synthesized from amino acids. So the endocrine glands that release monoamines start with an amino acid, and then they remove the carboxyl group. That forms a monoamine. Monoamine means one amino group. Okay. The monoamines include, so these are kind of derivatives of amino acids. It includes dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, melatonin, and thyroid hormone. Okay. Those are derivatives of amino acids. And then thirdly are the peptide hormones. Peptide hormones are small proteins that can consist of anywhere from 2 to 200 amino acids. And nearly all of the hormones, which are called releasing factors produced by the hypothalamus, are peptide hormones, as well as most of the hormones of the anterior pituitary, the two hormones produced by the pancreas, insulin and glucagon, are peptide hormones. Parathyroid hormone, and there's many, many others. So peptide hormones, however, are polar. They're polar compounds. And so they can't go through the cell membrane. So instead, they have to bind to a receptor on the cell surface in order to produce their effect. So they have a very different mechanism than the steroid hormones. Okay, so once the hormone is synthesized and released from the endocrine gland, it has to be transported in the blood. And that's not much of a problem for the monoamines and the peptide hormones because those are both polar compounds. And the plasma of the blood is made up mostly of water, which is also polar. So monoamines and peptides can be transported just simply by dissolving into the plasma of the blood. So they don't need any special transport mechanism. They're just carried by the plasma of the blood. Steroid hormones, though, have a problem. Steroid hormones are nonpolar. Nonpolar substances don't mix very well with polar substances. It's like trying to mix vinegar and water together, like in an Italian dressing. You shake the bottle, it mixes up, and you let it sit for a few seconds, and the vinegar and the water separate. So in order for steroid hormones to be transported by the blood, they first have to bind to a carrier protein or a transport protein. By complexing with a transport protein, which is a polar substance, that allows the steroid hormones then to dissolve into the plasma and be transported by the blood. So without that transport protein, steroid hormones wouldn't be able to get to their target organ. So that's another point where where things could go wrong. If you don't have enough of the transport proteins for the steroid hormones, they're not going to be able to be transported by the blood. The other thing that has to happen is once the steroid hormones bind to their transport protein and they're transported to the area of their target organ, the steroid hormone has to disassociate from the transport protein in order to get into the cells where they have their effect. And so it's only the unbound portion of the hormone that actually can have an effect on the target cells. And then another function of these transport proteins is that they also protect the hormones from being broken down by enzymes in the plasma, and it protects them from being broken down by the liver and then being excreted by the kidneys. So by being bound to transport proteins, that reduces the amount of steroid hormones that have to be secreted by the endocrine glands, because the transport proteins protect them from being broken down. Okay, we've only got about 4 minutes left, so let's just go over one of the two major mechanisms by which hormones produce their effect. Okay, so the one I'm going to go over today, because this is the easiest one to explain, is the mechanism of action for proteins and the catecholamines, which are similar to the neurotransmitters. Catecholamines are mainly the monoamines, like dopamine and epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these amino acid derivatives and proteins, since they're polar compounds, they can't go through the cell membrane very easily. So instead, they bind to a receptor that's embedded in the cell membrane. So a part of that receptor sticks out to the outside of the cell. And there's an active site on that receptor where the hormone binds. So this whole mechanism here is called the second messenger mechanism. Okay, that's the name of it. So the hormone is the first messenger. It binds to the receptor. The receptor then activates a protein on the inside of the membrane called a G protein. The activated G protein then activates an enzyme that's embedded in the cell membrane. This enzyme then catalyzes a chemical reaction that converts a compound inside the cell into a different compound. So the end product of the reaction that's catalyzed by the enzyme is the second messenger. And one very common second messenger that's produced by the second messenger mechanism is a compound called cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is formed when if you break off two phosphates off of ATP. ATP is actually a compound that all cells use for energy, but it's also used in the second messenger mechanism. So what happens is this enzyme breaks off two phosphates off of ATP, and it produces cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP can then activate other enzymes inside the cell that can lead to physiological changes inside the cell. So it can change the metabolism of the cell on the inside. So you have the first messenger is on the outside of the cell. The second one, though, is produced on the inside of the cell. It could actually activate a whole enzyme cascade that can eventually produce a physiological effect. If the catecholamine happens to be thyroxine or thyroid hormone, the end effect could be to increase the concentration of the enzymes involved in cellular respiration. So it can increase ATP production inside the cell. Okay. So you have the hormones, the first messenger, you have an enzyme, activates a G protein, the G protein activates an enzyme, that produces a second messenger, which changes the metabolism of the cell. Okay? It's pretty straightforward, really.